that don't watch this video. Just a bit of a joke. This is a video which includes an excerpt from the podcast I recently recorded with the guys over at Draft Chaff. Draft Chaff's a fantastic podcast which I really recommend to give a listen. They start around the same time as this channel and they follow a kind of similar ethos to what I do here. Some competitive draft content, but also just some content on the love of draft and the passion that we have in draft. I went in with this idea where we were looking at what it's like to attend your first in-person event, especially if you're coming from arena, and some tips and tricks just to make that event as smooth as possible. So it's something which I had really good fun doing. I just enjoyed chatting to them. This video, like I say, is the expert. It's the main portion of the interview, but what I would recommend is actually go and listen to the full podcast because there's some cool stuff there, and just listen to their podcast in general because it's really, really worth a listen. Thanks for watching the video or listening to the podcast, and I hope you enjoy it.
All right, let's get into the main topic for today. So we are talking about heading back to Friday Night Magic, which is pretty relevant nowadays. We've been planning this episode for a while, and I guess things have slowly started opening back up. So a lot of listeners have become vaccinated or live in areas with high vaccination rates and have local game stores opening back up for paper events. So from what we've heard, talking to our listeners and talking to people in game stores, a pretty significant portion of the listener base started playing online during the pandemic. So signing up for a paper draft might be a new experience. So we're here to help you navigate this process, make sure you know everything you got to do for an in-person Magic the Gathering draft or a game or whatever it might be.
Also worth mentioning, if you're listening to this sometime in the future and you haven't, dealt with the whole pandemic situation, or you're just trying to figure out F&M or in-person draft for the first time, regardless of your situation, I think you'll still get something out of this. So definitely be ready to take notes or whatever you might need to do to get some insight out of what we have to talk about here.
So we want to mention, first of all, that it's important to stay safe and take the precautions that are correct for wherever you are geographically in the world. Here in the U.S., we've got the Delta variant on the rise right now, so some places are reenacting mask mandates, while some places are maybe shutting down or only having limited hours. Just make sure you're familiar with what your local area or LGS requires, whether it be masks, proof of vaccination, social distancing during the tournament itself. Ultimately, the point of this game is to have fun and have a good time, right? So whether it's by winning or just messing around, it doesn't matter. You want to make sure you respect the people that you're doing that with by keeping them safe from the pandemic. So if you're listening to this many years in advance, ignore that. Hopefully the pandemic ended. I'm glad you're having fun out in a non-pandemic world. If you're listening currently, then I think it'll be especially relevant for that. So let's just break down what a draft is going to look like. When you actually get there, you sign up, you paid, you sit down at a table with 7 other people. You'll have 3 packs in front of you. You'll open the first one. You'll remove the land and the token, unless it's like a weird set. Snow lands didn't get removed from Kaldheim, and I think sometimes other stuff happens.
Funnily enough, just going to stop you there, because technically, actually, most draftees are supposed to leave the land in these days because I think there's so many where the land is supposed to be left in. It's that was a rule change a year or two ago. Just as you're coming into the section, I saw that mentioned on the show notes, and yeah, it's probably worth mentioning. I don't think anybody would have a problem if you end up taking the land out or something like that. It's not that big of a deal. But technically, the rulings are, from an organised play perspective, is you leave the land in always now.
Good call. I guess I'm learning something today, too. It has been quite a while since I did an in-person draft, to be fair. I was thinking of going sometime in the next few weeks, but I guess now I'm prepared, too. So now all of us are getting something out of this. So you'll leave the land in, and then reveal any double-sided cards. So on paper, this is actually important. On Arena, it doesn't matter because the other players at your draft can't see the, double-sided DFC that you opened. But in paper, it's correct to reveal it so that everyone can see, because that way it's not like one person caught a glimpse of the back of your, Halvar, and they were like, ooh, that guy's got to be in white now. So usually at these types of things, you just reveal the double-sided card to everybody at the table. This will be especially relevant in Innistrad because I can't imagine them getting through a vampire set and a werewolf set with no flip cards, right? That's just not possible.
I'd be surprised.
I hope so.
So you'll take your first pick, and then pass the pack to the left. And then someone will be passing a pack to you as well. So you do this, you repeat until all cards are gone from the pack. Then you repeat this, passing to the right. Some people may have been drafting on Arena without ever really noticing this left-right dichotomy. I mean, if you never look at the arrows at the top or the little direction of the packs, you might not even know. And then you'll have some time to build your deck, maybe get in some practice games. Pairings will go up. There's this handy new companion app now that we got our first experience with at the pre-release. Good job on the companion app, Magic. It's pretty useful. You'll see pairings go up on there. You'll see who you're paired against. Sometimes a local game store will have it up on a screen too. And then you're good to go.
Yeah, also, quick little mention, if you're interested in learning how to draft in more detail, because that was a very high-level understanding of how drafting works. We did do an episode a while ago on how to draft, so definitely check that out in our episode backlog.
Yeah, that was a good episode, actually, because I remember listening to it, and you covered some good points there, and it's definitely something like this where people can go back to it at any time and pick up a few tips.
Thanks.
Just something to add into what you were saying there. So you say you go through the whole pack. I think it's 15 cards usually in a pack. Often between packs, you're allowed a bit of time to kind of look through your picks that you've seen, like you've had so far, just to remind yourself what you've picked. Some places, especially when it's a more casual draft, will allow you to kind of look whenever it's appropriate as well. But it's not just finish first pack, straight on the second pack. You do usually get a bit of time to reflect in between as well. But yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and to add to that too, some stores that I've been to in the past, the players if there are other players at the table who are seasoned drafters, might try to move on to the next pack right away. Do feel free to take your time. If you're new at drafting, look over your cards. Take your time, because the table's there. They're not going anywhere, and you shouldn't feel rushed to try to get on to your next packs, because you're probably not going to draft as good as you might have otherwise if you're rushing. So take your time and enjoy it.
Yeah, and maybe even, I think we're going to touch on this a little bit later on, but even before you sit down at the table, introduce yourself. Tell people it's your first event. Tell people it's your first paper event, because they'll understand. They should understand. And they know to cut you a little bit of slack as well, and to make sure you know what's going on, and just explain things. Once you sat down at the table, it sometimes makes a lot more sense when people can actually say, look, this is what we're sitting. I'm going to be passing to you, then you're going to be passing to this person. And people are friendly, and I think draft crowds tend to be some of the friendlier bunches in Magic a lot of the time, in my experience.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's not actually obvious when you're playing on Arena, but you typically will draft your cards face down when you're drafting in person, and so you won't actually see your cards. Depends on the store and the casuality of the event. A lot of F&M style drafts, most stores don't care if you're looking at your cards mid-pick, but typically you would draft the cards face down and not look at them throughout the draft until that section between packs where you can look through, as Chris was mentioning. So do keep that in mind. Don't draft your whole deck face up, especially because that tells everybody at the table what you're drafting, and that's not always a good thing when you're playing against your pod.
Yeah, although between when you do the draft and when you play, often you'll build your deck face up. Some places will allow you to go separate off. I know on occasion when I've had a pretty spicy deck which kind of relies on some sneaky stuff, I have said, look, I'm just going to take my stuff away. I'd like to keep it a little bit of a surprise, but usually I'll just build a deck with people there and ask people for help with deck build and think, oh, I've got 24 cards here, I need one more cut, what do you think? At most places that's perfectly acceptable to do, unless you're playing at some kind of competitive event where it's not acceptable. But at regular rule enforcement level, it's perfectly fine to do that. So when you're going to play the game, so you've done the draft, you've built your deck, you've grabbed some lands, potentially from the store. If you take some yourself, you can use your own basic lands. So you sit down with your opponents, and it's probably important to say that paper events are all going to be best of 3. So if you're used to playing best of 1 on Arena, it's going to be best of 3. But you sit down against your opponents, you would normally offer to, so you would shuffle your decks up, you'd roll to see who was going to go first, or see who gets to choose to go first. You can choose to go second, although it's usually encouraged that you choose to go first these days. And you shuffle up and allow your opponent to cut your deck. That might not be happening everywhere at the moment because of COVID and trying to minimise contact between people, but I think a few places probably will be doing that. My local store tending away from that at the moment, but normal circumstances you will be offering to cut your deck as a show of goodwill. So you draw your hand, you draw your starting hand, you draw 7 cards, and if you're going to go first, you'll start playing, and then you'll pass the opponent, and then they'll draw a card for their first turn. So something that I've noticed when playing with people who've only started playing on Arena, or only started playing digitally, is the single hardest thing for them to understand is that you've got to draw a card at the start of every turn, and it's the thing that's always missed. Because I think a lot of the other interactions are things that you've got to do. You've got to tap your mana to cast your creatures. You've got to tap your creature to attack and things like that. But you don't have to draw your card. You do have to draw your card, but it's not an obvious mandatory thing to do. And I think when you're first sitting down, there's so many things going on in your head. It's quite an easy thing to forget about. You want, I need to untap my lands, and which Arena normally does for me, and you worry about all that stuff. So that's one that I've noticed gets missed a lot.
Another one is making sure you play your land, or I guess more specifically, making sure you don't play a second land for turn. I think the second most common thing I tend to hear behind, ooh, did I draw this turn, is, did I play a land already this turn? So just remember, when you play your lands, maybe keep track of what turn it is. Make sure you don't go over the number of lands that you have in turns, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And because Arena does take a lot of shortcuts for you. So, as I'm sure people who are listening to this who are wanting to go into paper events are aware, that there is a lot more stuff you need to think about. But it's a learning curve, and it's quite a quick one, I think. You can quite quickly get into the muscle memory. I think when I first got back to playing paper after not playing paper for a while, it took a little bit of time for those muscle memory things to come back. But you fall into habits quite quickly. And one other thing to mention at this point as well, you are sitting against another human being. It's not just you sitting against your screen. You need to remember that. It's quite customary to say to your opponent, good luck. You might even say, how did your draft go? They might not want to say exactly how it went. They might say, I've got some nice spicy bombs in there you'll enjoy seeing, or it seemed to go okay, I don't know. But you can have a conversation with your opponent, and that's a big difference to when you're just playing against an avatar on the screen, some random Johnny avatar that you're seeing across the table from you.
Yeah, you're not blowing up planeswalkers here. You're actually sitting down across from a real person, have a conversation with them, introduce yourself, make it feel comfortable, especially if you're new to in-person events. The more comfortable you can make yourself feel by making others feel, the more fun everybody's going to have at that event. So
I guess I've been attempting to maintain the same amount of human interaction virtually by just spamming emotes. Okay, maybe spamming is a tough word. Frequent use of the crying Hedron emoji when missing land drops, or the angry Hedron emoji when they play their Westgate region or something like that. Although I will say there's no substitute for the real thing.
No, there's not. And I mean, the flip side of that as well is to kind of keep yourself calm. I think we've all succumbed to a little bit of salt, is the best way to describe it. I'm liable to it myself, as my friends know. But you are playing against another person, and there's one thing getting a bit frustrated and taking yourself away from the draft when you're playing on Arena or something like that. It's not really affecting anybody. But if things aren't going your way in person, then you kind of just need to absorb it and remember that you're playing with people who are also there to enjoy their time. And every match is going to have one winner and one loser. So
and that goes back to a Mental Magic episode we did on enjoying your losses. So check that out if you're interested in learning how to do that. But for sure, I mean, everybody's there to have fun, especially when we're talking about F&M events. They are relatively low stakes. Most people are there just to enjoy the draft, to meet with some people, maybe hang out with some friends. So, keep that in mind. You're not playing for $1 million or anything. Have fun. Mm-hmm. Now, there are a few other things that we wanted to talk about that do differ between in-person and online play. We covered a few of them, like having a real person sitting across from you. Definitely don't forget about that. But there are a few other things that you might not have thought about when you decided to go to an in-person event that are going to be pretty relevant. So one of those is you have to actually handle your cards. I think something, especially me having been a long-time paper player prior to the last year, and now having played probably more Magic Online in the last year than I've played in person my entire life. Handling your cards when you're not used to handling your cards takes some effort. It is not the most easy thing to do right off the bat. You have 7+ cards in your hand depending on the deck you're playing, and you have to draw and move your lands around and tap to attack and all these different things. Okay, and on top of that, you are playing in a pod, you don't have the typical arena situation where you'll draft against a pod and then play against random players. You are playing against the people that drafted with you. So that is something to keep in mind. Your decks are going to be of a relatively similar power level on average, unless you are the only person drafting the colors in your pod. And often you'll notice that. I mean, that part doesn't really change. We're used to drafting with people online at this point, but you will be playing against those people. So keep that in mind when you pass a card that this actually kind of brings up the topic of hate drafting, which we don't really see anymore because, I mean, now we see rare drafting, right? But in person, there's this notion of hate drafting, and the idea is to take a card in a pack when you otherwise don't have a great pick. Take a card that you don't actually want to play against because your opponents will end up with that card if you don't take it. So it's something to keep in mind. Not necessarily highly recommended to do, but there are, you're going to be playing against the cards that you see in your draft, whether you draft them or not. So keep that in mind as well. Another part that's kind of huge with Arena is it does all the thinking for you in terms of what's on the battlefield and such. So in person, you have to remember your triggers. You have to draw at the start of your turn, which we talked about. It's a huge one. But you have to remember to keep track of your life total. You have to remember any of your combat triggers, any of your upkeep triggers, which there can be a lot of at times. You have to remember to put counters on things and use dice depending on the cards. And with AFR, we're used to rolling dice. You're going to have to actually roll a die. So there are a lot of different things like this to keep track of. You can make this a little bit easier on yourself by using the spin downs that you can find that are sequential in number on the D20, so you can easily track what number's next, and it saves you some time. You can also use companion apps. There are plenty of them that do life tracking for you and your opponent at the same time, so you can kind of keep track of things more easily that way. Doesn't hurt to have a handful of D6 dice around so that you can use them for counters and such on your creatures, and just try to keep track of all these different little things that are going on as you're going through the game, because we're used to Arena handling all this stuff for us.
One of the trickiest things that I've always found in Paper is remembering to do something before you draw your card for the turn. So a handy little trick, just put one of your D6s on top of your deck. For example, if you had a card that said, tap to scry one, Argyar Battleseer, or whatever, and you want to scry on your upkeep, well, just put a little thing there, so then as you go to draw that card, you go, wait a minute, something I'm supposed to do right now, because depending on the rule enforcement level, sometimes you'll be allowed to take an action back or kind of mess with it a little, especially like pre-releases or casual FNMs. An opponent might be like, yeah, whatever, just walk it back like a step. But sometimes if you're against a more competitive player, or if you're in a more competitive store or environment, you might just, miss the thing. So if you meant to scry on upkeep and you forget, that's probably when you're not going to get to take back.
Yeah, definitely. And, that's kind of looking between the competitive and casual. And, casual events are there, but sometimes when it's that third round of a 3-round event or something, there is a little bit on the line as well, especially if there's a nice promo for first place or something. So you can see why people might want to try and err a little bit closer to the strict way to do things. But I don't think you can really hold it against the opponent in most cases when they want to do that as well. But it's nice when people are willing to roll things back. And again, it comes back to saying, if you introduce yourself as a new player right at the start of the night, then people might be more willing to cut you a little bit of slack. And when they know what the score is.
Yeah, and so that brings us to reasons you might want to play in person. We just talked about a few things that kind of make you think maybe I shouldn't play in person. There's all this extra stuff I have to keep track of. I've got to talk to people. Well, that's one of the big reasons to play in person, right? Is that you actually get to interact with people. Winning can be a lot less important when you're playing in person. I think we're a little inundated now with the amount of games we can play. You can just string them all together, and you never really have to stop drafting if you don't want to. And sometimes too much of a good thing is a bad thing, right? So in this case, you can play your 3 rounds. You get 1 draft in, play your 3 or 4 rounds, depending on the story you're at, and just have a lot of fun with some human interaction, enjoy the people around you, talk about the awesome draft you had. Everybody has those draft experience stories to share, and when you can share them with the people who were involved in the draft, it's all that much better. So definitely take advantage of that. You have plenty of time to discuss your plays and your picks, and oftentimes, because there is a round timer in most events, you'll have 50 minutes to play all 3 of your games in your best of 3 match, including sideboarding and things of that nature. And then it does go to turns after that, which is a section of the game where there's no time limit, but you have so many turns to finish the game or it ends in a tie. And you do have that time limit, but if you finish before that time limit, there's plenty of time to talk about your games. If you're newer to Magic in general, not just coming from Arena, this is a great time to say, hey, how could I have done better? Or how could I have played this turn out in a different way that might have made a difference for the game? Whether you win or lose, it's always good to get some information from your opponent and see how they were thinking through the turn, or maybe ask them, what were you thinking on this turn? And why did you do it this way versus this way? And, it can lead to some really interesting conversations and level your game up at the same time.
I think that goes back to the draft. Sorry, I was going to say, I think that jumps back to the draft portion as well, not necessarily straight after the draft's finished, but people know what they've been passed, and they might say, oh, well, why did you pass this card? Like, this seemed like really good. It was, why was I passed pick 3 Ranger class? That's a pretty extreme example, but it might be a Grim Bounty was passed pick 4, something like that, and you think, well, that seems quite unusual. Or you ended up in black, well, you passed me some good stuff pack 1. What happened? Did you pivot part of the way through the draft? So it's not just the games where you get to talk about that, it's the draft section as well it comes up in. And another difference as well, because you're playing in paper and you see the people who you're playing with, you get to see what everybody else's decks are. Not necessarily straight away, sometimes you get the same straight away, but you get to see how it's broken down. And if you've only played on Arena, you might assume that it's always quite nice, and you get a red-green player, then a blue-black player, then a white-green player, then it's nice and like evenly distributed. When a lot of time that's not the case. You'll often have like 3 green drafters right next to each other. Well, maybe not often, but there's sometimes it's heavily skewed to one side of the table, and it gives you a bit more of an understanding of how people are picking cards, and how the signals are affecting the packs that you're seeing.
Yeah, and if you're worried about or a little bit tired of the constant red-black mirrors, don't worry about that in person, because again, you're playing in pods, so it's very unlikely that 2 people will draft super highly powered versions of the same deck.
Yeah.
Now, this might be a personal preference, but I love playing in person because you can bluff. And that's not really something you can do as effectively online. You can, but there's little things with like the arena stops, and for example, at this point, by now, I know that if my opponent has a stop after they play, I don't know, like they open on like mountain, and then they have like a brief stop, and then nothing else. I'm like, oh, they have dueling rapier. I just know they have it. So in paper, that doesn't happen. In paper, you can get a little more creative. For example, one of my favorite things to do is send a 2/2 at my opponent's 3/3. Just send it in and just look them straight in the eyes, and just see what they do. Doesn't matter if I have the trick or not. I like to have the trick, but I'm very comfortable doing that with no trick at all.
And another one you can do is, if you see them going to do something about it, like, I don't know, if they've got a block, then just slightly reach towards your lands, like you're going to tap them for something. That's one I've done in the past. Might be a bit more sneaky, but it's well within the rules. It's well within that. But I think that's especially what to do if you know the person that you're across from as well. And that's one I've pulled once or twice. It's a bit like when you mouse over your card on Arena just to make them think that you're reading a card, but it's actually a basic forest.
Yeah. Actually, sandbagging a land in your hand is a little bit more useful in paper because there's no auto pass function in paper. I top deck my forest. I'm going to spend a minute looking at that thing. Obviously within reason. I'm not going to stall the game out. And sometimes there are usually more reasons to play out your lands than to potentially sandbag them. But you can get funny with little things here and there.
I just want to take it back a little bit, sorry, because you're going through and we've talked about winning is less important. I'm definitely a lot more likely to draft some nonsense deck in paper than I am on Arena, because I generally play Premier Draft on Arena, and I've talked about it in the Discord before. If you don't get those 3 wins, it's really punishing if you don't get it on Arena. There's a huge discrepancy from if you go 0 wins to 7 wins. Obviously, it's a little bit different. It's usually a 3-round format in paper. 3 or 4, depending on how many people are playing. But if it's an 8-person pod, it's going to be usually a 3-round pod, 3-round match. So in paper, you pay in, you get some packs. If you win, you might get 3 packs in a promo or something like that, maybe. Like, it depends on the store, obviously, what their prize structure is. Some places might not even have any prizes. And okay, it's nice when you get that, but it's not the end of the world. It's not going to stop you from drafting the next week. Whereas on Arena, if you don't get those 3 wins or 4 wins, you might not be able to draft again for another week on Arena, which we're talking about things that are a week apart, but unless you want to put cash into Arena, it's a hard stop. And yes, you're playing cash in person, but you're also paying that cash for the experience, the social side of things, and the cards that you get to take away. You get to keep those physical cards, and those physical cards, like it or not, have a value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've seen that matter very heavily depending on the format. If you're drafting Modern Horizons 2 and you open a Ragavan, well, there's a few drafts for you.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you don't quite get that on Arena, unfortunately. But yeah, walking away with actual stuff is a big reason to play in person as well.
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said I haven't, slammed a foil promo, alt art, whatever, over what might have been the correct pick. Because when you show up and you play that thing, it's like, well, you did it. You got there.
Yeah, I mean, also, you just mentioned foil promos. You get foil promos in packs. You get the showcase things where you don't get that on Arena. You just get them through your Mastery Pass or cosmetics and things. So, I was going through a pack on Monday, and it's like, oh, these showcase cards are really nice, actually, aren't they? And sometimes you just take it because it looks cool and because the other picks weren't really going to do anything for you.
So I wanted to go through a few do's and don'ts of paper play. Just think of it as a miscellaneous section. So when you're passing your packs in a draft, you don't want to cause a pileup. I've seen this happen a bunch of times where someone will have, maybe they're taking a while on their pick, and they'll have like 3 packs that have been passed to them by the person to their right, and then someone bumps the table and the packs will get jumbled together. And it's a nightmare. You can't do anything about it. There's no way to fix that because, the information was hidden. So to stay organized, it's usually best to have only 1 pack, like waiting at a time for someone on a table. That's what I've noticed is common courtesy throughout my years of paper drafting. You'd like to keep one in your hand, waiting to put down, and then wait for them to pick up that pack from the table before you replace it with the one that you passed. And sure, you might have one on your right, maybe someone's passing to you and they're getting slowed down, but it keeps the flow of pack traffic a little more even. Would you guys agree that tends to be the best strategy? I don't know if there's different customs in different local game stores.
Yeah, I think that's been my experience as well. We tend to draft at the similar places, though, so that's a little bit skewed in that way. But one thing that you don't really experience that with is in Arena, you can just pile up all the drafts, or all the packs, rather. I mean, it does slow the pod down, but there's no spatial issues there, right? You can just pile up the packs and take them at your leisure. And you can still take them at your leisure, but holding on to a pack while your opponent hasn't picked up the one you passed to them already can just make things much more concise and easy to follow when you're drafting in person.
Yeah, I think I agree. Sometimes I might have put a second, on occasion, a third pack down towards the end of a pack. But I think it's definitely the thing to do. I think on a similar note as well, make sure that your pick pile, so you're probably putting everything in one pile. Some people do do a couple of different piles, but make sure it's really distinct from what you're passing on.
Definitely.
So the person who you're passing to isn't going to accidentally pick up the deck that you're drafting at that point.
I've seen that happen. Yeah, for sure.
It's always embarrassing when it happens.
Information reveal wise and just like you screwed up wise. Another bit of draft etiquette. This is probably the biggest one. What Chris was saying earlier about like remarking about I got a late rare or something like that. What he was saying is the right way to talk about the results of a draft. The wrong way to do it is going, why is this card still in the pack? And I've heard that said so many times, and someone will be drafting and they'll be like, wow, why is this plundering barbarian still in the pack? This is an A-level card. And everyone will look at them and just think, man, what a jerk. What's going on here? Like, they're never talking about like a Grandmaster of Flowers or something like that. Everyone knows the Planeswalkers are playable. But when someone is just making a big deal, all that accomplishes is making the person directly to their right and maybe a few more over to the right feel like an idiot. And that is not why we're here to do things. So there's a better way to do this. Like Chris was saying earlier, just talk about it afterwards. Just say like, wow, like green was open, or what was your first pick? There's ways you can talk about this without being a jerk to the people and making them feel like they made the wrong pick or a dumb decision.
And, it comes down to it. You get foils in the pack. You can get 2 rare packs. So sometimes you'll get a surprising pick and think, oh, well, they've taken a common, but actually it was a foil rare. or which is potentially better, or just worth the money. So yeah,
Definitely. I think it's also good to keep in mind to just be patient and polite while you're drafting. Sometimes the people to your right will be brand new. Sometimes you're the least experienced at the table. Just take your time with the draft, or else it can get kind of messed up, and then no one has fun. And another thing that you should keep in mind, call a judge if you have to. A lot of stores, in the US at least, apparently this isn't true everywhere. I want to say pretty much every store I've seen in the US will have at least one judge-level employee, or sometimes a player will have like judge experience, and they can help you work out a tricky rules interaction, or sometimes you have to like walk back the game state a turn or two if someone missed a really important trigger or something like that.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to ask for that. If you're discussing something with your opponents, you might kind of both be agreed on what the action should be, but if it's quite important action, you might just want to get a third party, whether it's a judge or somebody else who's just knowledgeable of the game, to advise on what the best course of action should be, or a rules interaction as well. So sometimes you get some really complex rules interaction. Do you know what happens when if somebody mind flayers your mind flayer?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what actually happens then?
Ooh, let me think. So it's until Mind Flayer says gain control of target creature as long as you control Mind Flayer.
Yes.
Right. So let me guess. If so, let's say I have a Mind Flayer. Someone Mind Flayer. All right, let's walk it back. Judge. So I Mind Flayer my opponent's Barbarian.
Yep.
They then Mind Flayer my Mind Flayer.
Yep.
Both go back to the other side.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Which I got wrong on my achievement list. So I got that wrong on my achievement list because it is an unusual interaction, and it involves two rares that you're going to rarely see together. So.
Yeah, and a lot of times those effects are worded such that it's do the thing until this leaves the battlefield, and so
that's it.
Saying that it happens until you lose control of it really changes things up, and it's not something we're used to seeing. So I totally understand that.
Yeah,
I think I had this come up once with Price of Loyalty, where I was surprised to see like one thing stick on the other side of the battlefield when I didn't think it was supposed to, or something like that. But again, helpful to have judges nearby or someone that knows the rules.
Yeah, there's no harm in going, I'm pretty sure I know how this works, but I just want to make sure. So, jumping back to the start almost here, we've talked about what happens when you're in the store and things like that. Some prep to do before you go to the store, before you even get there. I would say before doing anything else, you can actually contact the store, say, look, I'm thinking about coming down, it'll be my first draft. The store might be able to just make sure there's somebody on hand. They might make sure that they have the judge working that night, whereas might not always have that on. But I still vividly remember my first draft. I messaged the store, but it was a chain, and it was actually, I messaged a different store, and they didn't realise I was wanting to go somewhere else, so... but they were very welcoming when I got there, and they knew I was there. They said, "Oh well, actually, if you go sit next to this person, they'll make sure you're okay," and that really helps. And stuff you might want to bring. So yourself, obviously, you're taking yourself. You're going there, and you are going to an event in person, and make sure that you're preparing yourself to go. A life tracker, something way to track your life, which we've already talked about with D20. But a paper is absolutely fine. I actually used paper for a long while before I actually got a D20 to spin down. Sleeves are definitely optional, I would say, but I think they're a big quality of life improvement as well. You would think that sleeves would be mainly for protecting your cards, but actually one of the first benefits that I've found, and still to this day, one of the reasons why I want to play with sleeves in a draft, because most of the cards you're going to draft aren't going to be worth very much at all, is actually it's a lot easier to shuffle with sleeves. If you ever,
Definitely.
Yeah, so like I go back to like shuffling playing cards now, and I can't just mash shuffle. I just can't shuffle in my hand. You've got to do the riffle and stuff like that. So it is actually quite a big quality of life improvement. We've talked about counters. Often you're going to be using D6s to represent +1/+1 counters and things like that, or where you are in the dungeon or something. And if you have played paper, if you do have some paper cards, take your trades, because like you say. A match will last 50 minutes. Most matches that you play, you won't go to time because it's a conservative amount of time to allow 90% of people to finish. So when you're doing that, you can talk about the draft, you can talk about some tips, you can talk about what you're doing in the rest of your life, and you can also do a few trades. You can see what your opponent's got in their trade binder, and you might want to trade or buy a card or sell cards or something like that. And if you've got any other decks as well, sometimes you might just want to squeeze in a quick game of Modern or Standard or EDH in between. Even if you don't get to finish the game, sometimes it's just a way to fill the time. So if you've got the decks to bring, just bring them along. If you don't use them, you don't use them. But you might get that chance.